Just for training purposes, though, so don't worry. When COVID first hit and the shul shut down, we made a decision about what kind of programming we needed to offer as a shul. There were all sorts of instincts and impulses among the rabbinate and leaders across denominations. And one instinct was, we need to plow people over with programming. We need to offer 14 shiurim at every half hour on every time zone across the country. And I understood that impulse. The impulse was, I need to do something, and I feel like I'm not doing anything. I think a lot of people felt overwhelmed by that response. You know, people don't have 24 hours a day to listen to things, and suddenly there was now a feeling of guilt that we all need to do it. And the conclusion I think we came to as a community was, we need to offer programming that addresses three central psychological needs that every person on the planet was in need of. Number one was community. We needed to feel like we weren't alone. We were part of a community. We had support. Number two was continuity, that despite the massive scale changes that was happening in an unprecedented way. Of course, there had been pandemics before, but there had never been pandemics when the whole world knew about it at the same instant and was plowed by 24-hour news of it. And we knew which cities across the globe were shut down, and that there were days when literally the globe was shut down. That was an astonishing change. And we felt we needed to give a sense of continuity. The davening is still happening every day, that the parashah is still happening every week, that we are still here, that the world is still moving, and things aren't all changing. And the third need we tried to address, I think the hardest one to address, was to give people a sense of empowerment, not just community, that we're together, not continuity, that things are not all changing, but a sense of empowerment. There is things that we can do, because of course, as you hear news about Melbourne and Paris and Lebanon and South Africa shutting down, and we're sitting here in our homes thinking, I have no power. There is nothing I can do, which I suggest was part of the instinct to plow people with shiurim. It's something I can do. I can give a shiur 24 hours a day, whether it's helpful or not. But that need to have power, and that's of course the hardest thing to program. How do you program to other people to do things? But we try to offer occasions for that for people. And that feeling of disempowerment that was instigated by this initial crisis, I think it just exacerbated a feeling we all have at times in life. Even last year, when things globally didn't seem as catastrophic, we all at times feel things happen to us and we end up doing things that are beyond our control. And we feel powerlessness, and that leads to a feeling of purposelessness. And then we feel lost, and we ask ourselves, can I make a difference? Are there things that I can do? And of course, Jewish life generally provides almost minute-by-minute opportunities to do things and feel that one is following a divine command, a divine path, which is a gift. I think we discovered in this time that while people were kind of wafting around and drifting in a cosmos of lack of power, people knew, okay, I pick up a piece of food, I can say a bracha and feel like I'm doing something. I'm engaging with the cosmos. It's nighttime, I can daven Mariv. And I think that we offered every night at 9:30 Mariv. People who wouldn't ordinarily have been able to find time or make time to say Mariv on a weeknight sat down and said, you know what, I'm going to click on and I'm going to participate because it gives me a sense of purpose and power and direction and regularity. But that question, of course, has haunted humankind, I imagine, from Adam's first breath. At least the way Milton constructs it, it did haunt Adam. He wasn't born into a sense of perfection, but a sense of curiosity about purpose. What am I meant to be doing? Can I make a difference? And what I want to do, I'm going to share my screen with you, if I remember how to do that. It's been a little while. There you go. Give me a thumbs up. If you see it, that is. Excellent. What I'd like to do is address this question as it has been addressed through the centuries from Jewish and general perspectives on the power that we possess in the moral universe. That is the title, The Moral Universe. I'll get to in about 1 second why I picked that title, although I was met by a number of humorous reactions over Shabbat that this must be about a parallel universe, because we don't seem to inhabit a moral one, but I'll get to that in a moment. The subtitle, Fate, Free Will, and Responsibility, will of course come up, and I've split this into 3 parts. Now, after the experience with the electricity shirim earlier in the year, where I had designed a certain number of parts and I went till I finished that part each night, and it went quite late often, these are not necessarily going to fit neatly into 3 sessions. I'm aiming for 3 sessions, but these are just 3 parts that we'll discuss whenever we fit them in. But I will finish on time tonight so that you can have a good amount of sleep, please God, and feel like you have power, because this will end at the time that I told you it will. Which I don't know if I told you, but I'm aiming for 45 minutes for 9:15. And these 3 parts are, number 1, part 1, I've got the power. Now, part 2, a life of illusion. Part 3, where do I go from here? Now, I will give extra points to anybody who identifies whether these are songs or just titles. I'll give you a clue. They are all songs, and you will get points if you know who wrote them or where they appear. But we'll begin with essentially 2 major perspectives on the issues of whether we make choices, if we have power. The first position is, yes, you do have power. Every moment of every day, you have power in your hands, divinely granted, to determine your fate, your future, and the fate of your neighbors and your friends and your family. The second, and the main player, I should say, the protagonist of this section is going to be Maimonides, the Rambam, who embraces wholeheartedly the idea that we have free will. There is a second view, a life of illusion. The protagonist of this is a lesser known figure called Rabbeinu Crescus. I would be quite surprised if many of you have come across Rabbeinu Crescus, but he was a massively influential medieval figure who, at the time when we turn to part 2, I'll give you some background on him and why perhaps he isn't that well known despite his massive influence at the time. And he suggests that we have no power. We literally make no choices. We are a product of causal effects that lead back to the creation of the universe, and we possess 0 power to determine the choices that, which may strike you at once as being odd and not solving our problem, but compounding the sense of powerlessness. So I'll address how he touches on that, and how actually his view in the time that he wrote it was an attempt to console the Jewish population. We'll come to that at the time. And then part 3, where do we go from here? The Rambam, Maimonides, and Rabbeinu Crescus are medieval figures. And for all their influence and their weight and their acumen, how does it speak to today in the 21st century, when we have witnessed perhaps the greatest horrors, moral horrors in human history, and also have the greatest scientific availability about causal effects in life? What do we do with that information in the modern age? So that's roughly speaking going to be the outline of this series, but I'll begin with why I chose this title, The Moral Universe. There is a phrase, a turn of phrase that I am very fond of. It is poetic, it is uplifting, it is moving, it is hopeful, and it is often cited and has been cited by American presidents and great orators in the name of Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, it is inscribed at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. on a wall. I was going to use that picture as a background, but there isn't a clear one that I can find. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Now, I'll now invite somebody to tell me what that means. What does that mean to you when you hear the words, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice? What is the basic claim that's being made there?
Justice is divine. We don't see it all the time, but ultimately that's what we'll be.
Excellent, excellent. So, and that's why it's uplifting, I presume, as well.
Yeah, I hope so.
I mean, you found the way you've described that, you find that an uplifting message, I presume.
I find it sort of uplifting in the face of what might be frustrating, because it seems as if there is no justice, and ultimately there is hope. So it's, yes, I guess it's uplifting.
Great. I didn't see your face and you haven't popped through there, but that's Michael, I presume.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lovely to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Sure. So yes, I would tend to agree with that. I find this an uplifting statement because, and of course, this is Martin Luther King speaking in an age where, before the Civil Rights Act is passed. We actually, I think, either today or yesterday commemorated the March on Washington, which is, I think, part of his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which is not where he used this turn of phrase, but he used this phrase often. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, speaking to his followers and those who pursued civil rights and civil justice, saying that the arc is long. We're not there yet. It's going to take time, but it bends toward justice. And Michael used the word ultimately twice, meaning, and this is the word that I think is couched within ultimately, which is inevitably. Inevitably, we will have justice. And that's where this quote becomes complicated, because on its surface, it's hopeful, it rouses and it rallies protesters and civil rights activists, but there is a dimension here that one could call naive, or you could say that it involves religious belief, but there is an inevitability. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Embedded in that quote is justice will prevail. Not justice might prevail, not you need to act right now because otherwise things will fall apart. It'll take a long time. The arc is long, but it will happen. The sentiment within this quote, it makes us think of things like the Nazis winning World War II as essentially impossible. It couldn't possibly happen, and we live obviously in a post World War II age where we look back on history and think, yes, they didn't win. Of course, that's providence. How could, God would not have allowed him to win. Of course, horrific things took place. And we imagine there's an Amazon Prime series called The Man in the High Castle based on a novel, imagining an alternative history if the Nazis and the Japanese had won and they conquered America and split it in half, and there's a neutral zone somewhere in the middle. I don't know what, maybe Iowa, I don't know what's in the middle. Someone's gonna have to tell me what's in the middle of the country. Nevada, maybe, there was something, but the West Coast becomes Japanese, the East Coast becomes Greater Germany. And we can, in some, to forgive this turn of phrase, we can enjoy it almost as an impossibility, as a pleasurable mental exercise. What would have happened if they won? Because the sentiment contained within this phrase that I think at many levels, many of us imbibe, is that inevitably justice will prevail. But at the same time, that invites us to wonder, well, if it's inevitable, why should I do anything? Why could I do anything? I can't do anything because it bends towards justice. Whether I get up in the morning or I don't, whether I give charity or I don't, whether I pray or I don't, whether I protest or I don't, it bends towards justice. And actually, most recently, some orators have quoted this phrase, have said the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends toward justice, and we need to bend it, which kind of amends this to suggest that it's not inevitable. That actually, if we don't get up, if we don't act, if we don't engage, if we don't protest, if we don't alter the world, it can fall apart. There is not inevitability here. But that's why I wanted to talk about the moral universe, because that begs the question that we face here. And the truth is, before we turn to some of the Jewish texts, which we will, of course, get to, I want to just touch on some of the ways that we process this in our culture, that I imagine many of us have imbibed over time for our educations or our leisures. And of course, there are a few ways that this theme of free will has been discussed. There is a movie called Minority Report. I don't know how many of you saw this. It was a long time ago, starring Tom Cruise. It was a Steven Spielberg film, as you can see here, where in this film, there are three quasi-human figures who predict the future. They come up with predictions, and there is a whole new division of the FBI that arrests people for pre-crime, because they have a prediction of somebody committing murder. They send a unit to go and arrest them before the murder is committed. And what happens in this movie is this figure who works for this division of the FBI, there is a prediction that comes up on the screen, suggesting he's going to commit a crime. He's going to commit murder, which of course means now all his colleagues have to try and catch him. And he spends the movie fleeing. And the whole question, I'm not going to spoil the end, the whole question at the center of that movie is, can he defy that prediction? Are things inevitable? Are there causes that inevitably lead to results that we have no power, no human power that we possess to overrun? And I'll let you watch that movie in your own time, if you have time, to see what happens to Tom Cruise. There's another movie, again, not very well seen, called The Adjustment Bureau, this time with Matt Damon, which explicitly discusses religious themes. Matt Damon is a young congressman running for office who has high hopes of perhaps becoming president someday. And these figures here are called caseworkers, who have plans that are decided by the chairman. And they are kind of angelic beings who hover in and out of life. And the question, they keep telling him to stop trying to follow his love. He falls in love with some woman he sees on a bus one day, and they tell him to leave her alone because it interferes with the plan, the great plan. And essentially the question at the center of this movie is, can we change our destiny? Does he have to make, can he make a choice to follow love and follow his fate? Or are they mutually exclusive? Again, I'm not going to tell you how that ends, but it is Hollywood, so you have to assume there's a happy ending. For those who are more into more popular culture, of course, the Avengers series led up to a final moment which involved playing with time travel, because the main central antagonist, called Thanos, which of course is Greek for, anyone know Greek?
Yeah.
Yes. I didn't see who that was, but correct. Thanos is the Greek god of death. It means death. Thanatology is the study of death. And Thanos is the god of death who essentially wants to wipe out half of the living beings in the cosmos because they take up too many resources, etc. It's the same theory that Dan Brown plays with one of his books. I don't remember which one. I think it was the Comedy or the Inferno or something. But the line that Thanos is most famous for, every time they try to kill him, this group of Avengers, he says, "I am inevitable. You can't stop me. You can try all you will." And they go back in time, all sorts of, and he continues to win. And of course, the final end game, which is the name of the last movie, is a question about, is he inevitable? Or are there ways to overturn fate and maybe go back in time and change how things fall out? And of course, you can watch that 14 hours of Marvel Universe movies at some other point. That sums it up for you, though. But it's not just recent movies that have addressed this, again, deeply human, profoundly pivotal question. One of the oldest myths we have from Greek history is Oedipus. Some of you may be familiar with the Freudian theory of the Oedipus complex. Anyone familiar with the Oedipus complex?
Yes.
Yes.
My mother taught it to me.
Say again?
My mother taught it to me.
Your mother taught it to you. Excellent. Correct. So what is the Oedipus complex?
Kill your father, marry your mother.
Excellent. Not excellent. I don't endorse that. But yes, you are correct. My parents are asleep now in London, so I'm okay. They may listen to a recording, but I'm okay for the moment. Yes, Oedipus is the Greek myth, of course, thousands of years before Freud depicted it as a general universal human neurosis, at least as it pertains to men. Women he saw as having a different neurosis called the Electra complex. But the Oedipus complex plays out of the myth, the Greek play, in which Oedipus hears an oracle, which of course in Greek tragedy all the time happens. You have an oracle who says this will happen. And the rest of the play in Greek tragedy is essentially the protagonist trying to evade, which of course is impossible. Oedipus hears that he's going to marry his mother and kill his father. He says that's impossible. He runs away, so it can never possibly happen. And of course, what happens is he accidentally ends up killing his father and marrying his mother and blinding himself. Frasier has a very nice episode where Frasier with a young woman who is a spitting image of his mother. We can, watch that in your spare time too, although that's now taken off Netflix. If you find free Frasier somewhere, let me know. But either way, this, again, Greek tragedy plays on the issue of, can we evade fate? Once it has been pronounced by an oracle, is it inevitable? And in Greek tragedy, it is inevitable. Tragedy, by definition in the Greek genre was protagonists fighting against inevitable fate. This is Michael Fassbender in a modern version of Macbeth. Of course, Shakespeare playing on the same theme, where there are three witches at the beginning who say, foul is fair, fair is foul, foul is fair. Tell him he's going to be king, which involves him having to kill the king. But that plays with, does he inevitably become king? Does he make choices? And he gives a famous speech toward the end: tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow is just life, a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing, full of sound and fury. Basically confessing that life is meaningless if I'm just playing out of fate. If I'm just doing this because the witches said it and I've had no choice, what is the point? What is the point of everything that I do? All I do is walk along at a petty pace towards the dusty death. That's essentially how Macbeth deals with it. And of course, you've got more modern renderings. Dostoevsky deals with this again and again as a religious, theological thinker. Brothers Karamazov, he's got another novel called Notes from the Underground, which discuss free will. John Steinbeck in East of Eden deals with a young man who is the heir to a family who are known for their vice, who plays with the idea of whether he is free to deviate from the vice that he inherits or if it's inevitable. And it ends, of course, East of Eden. I will leave that for you to find out, but with a discussion of whether he has freedom. Now, we've looked at general culture a little bit, and there are ethical conclusions. It's not just literary imagination that deals with these. Of course, if I have no choice, and we all have no choice no matter what we do, that has a massive consequence for responsibility. If does something horrific, they're no longer responsible because they had no choice. And there is this modern philosopher, Bruce Waller, who essentially writes a book titled Against Moral Responsibility. And what I'll do very briefly, and I hope I've shared my screen in a way that this comes through, Rabbi Sachs, in advance of the Yamim Noraim, probably 15 years ago, had a segment on the BBC he called The Case for God, in which he had conversations with four famous British atheists, and he made the case for God as they made their case. It's on YouTube, you can find it. I've got a little clip for you which touches precisely on this, in which case he was discussing the question with a Professor Colin Blakemore, who is a reductionist scientist who believes that we're all a product of causes. And this is what Rabbi Sachs said to him.
Things. Do you seriously believe, Colin, that this entire Professor Colin Blakemore, who takes moral stands on the integrity of science and medical research, is actually a self-flattering myth that you are weaving around yourself, because actually all those little gray cells in your brain have worked this out long before and you never had a choice? You couldn't have been other than a professor of science.
Yeah, I do believe it. I mean, I believe that I am the sum total of all of the causal influences on me at the moment, and that is not a trivial issue.
So you really believe that you're deceiving
yourself? The really interesting
yourself,
question is, well, if it were true, then we'd have to abandon everything that we believe about the causal universe, about one event causing another, by all events having antecedent causes, and say that human beings are set aside from the rest of the physical world.
So that's his conclusion, that it is impossible to say we have free will and we're not just a product of causes, because if we say that, human beings have to be different from everything else in the world. For science to work, for the scientists and the researchers right now working on vaccines and cures for COVID and all sorts of maladies, for their research to hold, there are certain scientific principles that have to be inviolable, which include cause and effect. And the Professor Colin Blakemore is saying, if we want science to inhere and hold together, we have to believe cause and effect is universally true. So how can we come along and say humans are different? We are not a product of causes. When we were born, we were somehow given something unique, which of course we could make that claim, but he, not being religious, says, I don't believe that. And it's almost astonishing to imagine from his point of view that the words that I am saying right now, I'm not making the choice to say them. That was programmed millions of years ago, that the atoms would fly across the cosmos after the Big Bang, they'd settle, stardust would start to evolve, there would be amoeba and then two-celled beings, and then humanity would erupt out of prior species, and then we'd come to the year 2020, there would be COVID, which was inevitable because that bat was obviously going to come up and somebody was inexplicably going to eat it and cause this whole horrific business, and I would end up giving a shir before the Yom Noraim on August 30th, and I would say the words that I'm literally saying right now. So it was inevitable. That's his belief. There are, as we said, views among the Jewish scholars who believe that to be true as well. And we'll come to that in the second part. But the first part we'll come to in a moment. Before we turn to the Rambam Maimonides, I'm going to put to you a question, which is, where does the Bible stand on this question? Do our biblical protagonists appear to have free will? Do they appear to endorse free will? Does God appear to operate within the parameters of human beings have free will or not? And give me some examples.
Yes, they have free will.
Who has free will?
Abraham.
What gives you that impression?
He negotiates with God. I don't want to get into a whole Akedah debate, but he ultimately doesn't sacrifice.
Yeah, I think you're right in the way that we read it. I think if one takes the story without a lens to it, again, it would seem almost meaningless if he doesn't have a choice. Meaning, why is God? But this is the question people ask, which I think you didn't want to get into. People say, why does God need to test Abraham? If God knows everything, what's he testing Abraham for?
Right.
But of course, the question could be, Abraham doesn't have a choice. He's a product of his causes and effects. Why is God making this test? It was inevitably going to unfold this way, and Abraham never had a choice. And there is an indication of this in that in the very first conversation that God has with Abraham, Abraham receives promises. Promises. Not conditional promises. Promises. Pledges. Prophetic, oracular utterances from God saying, I will make you into a great nation. Which in an ancient world where oracular utterances are determinative, God's going to say something is not going to come true. And in fact, you're right. There are moments when Abraham turns to God and says, Ma'ida, how do I know this will happen? And he gets censured for it. What do you mean, how do I know it'll happen? I said it. I'm God. And what else does God promise? He says, for 400 years, you will have, your people will be in a foreign land and they'll be oppressed. Which then leads to the question among the commentators, if it's predicted, why are the Egyptians held responsible? God said it was going to happen. They didn't have a choice. God said they would be oppressed by a foreign people in a foreign land. The Egyptians at that point could have said, you know what, God, we didn't want to do this, but you said it was going to happen and we were fulfilling our fate. And the truth is, it's complicated. You're right. There are moments where biblical heroes, heroines, figures appear to suggest that we don't have free will. One of the first times that happens is Joseph's brothers come up to him and say, we're so sorry, we feel completely terrible and also quite vulnerable now that you're second in command in Egypt. We really feel terrible about selling you. And Joseph says at the bottom of the screen, V'atem chashavtem alai ra'ah. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm not even a little bit angry with you because even though you were thinking to do evil, so he does say, I know you were thinking to do horrible things, but he says, Elokim chashav tova. God, it was God's plan. This was the way it's meant to be. And I think what makes this question potent for all of us right now is I imagine there are so many times in life where we either hear other people say, or we say to other people, or if we don't want to say to other people, we say to ourselves, there was a reason for this. This was God's plan. I may think I made a mistake. I may think they made a mistake and something, but there was a reason. And that's exactly what Yosef says here. Yosef says, you thought this was bad, but God had a plan. And Yosef is not the only one to say this. Before we get to the other figure, we have a moment where free will plays a heavy part, forgive the pun, in the biblical drama, which is in Egypt, where Pharaoh is almost, it seems, on the brink of freeing the Jewish people, and God does what?
Hardens his heart.
Hardens his heart. Which seems, and then the medieval commentators again jump on this question. Hold on a minute, you've now removed his free will. He's not liable. As a side point, I'll note that Rabbi Sachs has a very interesting reading. I'm teaching a course at Stern this semester on the Jewish view on the world to come. And we're having a little look at the ancient world first to get a setting and the context. And in Egyptian lore, Lore, in Egyptian myth, the way you get into the afterlife is you meet up with gods. And what did they do? Anyone know what the myth suggests happened to you?
Bribe,
Excellent. They would, was that a yes?
bribe God.
Say again.
Bribe God.
Bribe God, yes. So it's interesting. There are a few ways you needed to get in. One was you had to confess not doing all sorts of sins. Whether you did them or not wasn't that pertinent, but you had to say that you didn't. So there is a little bit of dishonesty involved. But the main test to get in, they would weigh your heart on a scales against a feather. And if your heart was heavier than the feather, it was full of vice, and you didn't get in. So Rabbi Sachs suggests that not only is HaKadosh Baruch Hu writing a narrative for us, but he's writing this to polemicize the Egyptians, meaning to implicitly attack them by saying, what was God doing when he had conversation with Pharaoh? He was making his heart heavy. Kaveret Halev is making his heart heavy, meaning he's not getting into the afterworld. When they weigh his heart, it's a heavy heart against the feather. It's an interesting reading. We can leave that for another time. But yes, the question of free will comes up because God seems to remove it from Pharaoh, which implies it's always there, which again leads to a question. Yes.
Yes, if we're saying that we don't have free will, then it almost seems like a conspiracy that Hashem had where Moshe was concerned, that Moshe would never be able to enter Eretz Yisrael because, after all, he hit the rock. And if it wasn't his free will to hit the rock, then Hashem made him do it just so that he would, that all rings very wrong.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right. And we can broaden your question universally, meaning this is, again, what Macbeth says. Are we just walking shadows, merely players on a stage, signifying nothing? Meaning, God, what is this about then? Is this just a cosmic show for your benefit? If none of us have any free will at all, and every event in recorded time, which again is part of that speech, from Macbeth, as if time is recorded, meaning there's nothing we can do about it. So what is the point? No one is responsible for anything. Every time I make an argument, it was inevitable I was going to make that argument. Whatever the answer is, it's inevitable that's the answer will be. It seems purposelessness. And we're going to have to address that when we turn to the perspective. And I'm looking at the time, I realize we may not get to part one, the end of part one today. And when I say we may not, we definitely won't get to the end of part one today. But when we get to part two, we'll have to ask the question about the Jewish figures who believe that we don't have choice, that script is written. So where do we find meaning? What is
Rabbi, why would there be any question where so many times we hear from God, if you will listen to my commandments, you will have rain in its time? Well,
wonderful. So you have been reading Rav Saadia Gaon. So we're going to get to him in the first perspective. We'll get to him hopefully momentarily. But you're right. But I guess the challenge we'll come up against is that there are biblical source texts that push both ways. You have sentences that appear to say, "Uvacharta b'chaim," which literally means choose life, meaning you have choice. And then you'll have times like this on the page we have later in the book of Shmuel. David is in the midst of his power, becoming king, and there's a figure, Shimi ben Gera, who throws stones at him and curses him. Have a look in Shmuel Bet. Fascinating dramas unfold, and David's entourage want to attack this protester who's throwing stones and making names and such thing. And David says, hey, guys, don't be angry with him. He wants to rant and rave. Let him rant and rave. He wants to throw stones. Let him throw stones. V'yomar Melech, David says, Ma li v'lachem b'nei Tzruya. What is it between me and you? B'nei Tzruya, the children of Tzruya, his general, were the ones with him. He says, Ko yikalel, so he's cursing me. Ki Hashem amar lo kalel David, because God wants him to curse David. David says, don't be angry with him. It's not his fault. Obviously, he's doing this because God wants him to do this. Umi yomar, and who can ever say, Madua asita kain, why are you doing this? David in this moment seems to say, nobody can ever say to another human being, why are you doing this? Because the answer is always, God wanted me to. Which, again, smacks of unimaginable from the perspective of justice and ethics. But there are source texts that push in that direction. We have Yosef saying to his brothers, this was always the plan. We have David saying everything is God's plan. We have prophecies to Abraham predicting an unfolding future. So what are we meant to do? We'll leave Mayor Sternberg for another time, because we do want to turn to the first position. I've got the power, which some of you may know where that song is from. The truth is, I don't remember who wrote the song. I know it's been in a couple of movies that I've seen, including Power Rangers when I was about 8, and also Bruce Almighty, I think. There's a scene when Jim Carrey has that song plays when he realizes God gave him all the power. But now we turn to Maimonides. This is an image taken actually from the halls of Congress, where they have a wall of legislators. Only 2 Jews made it onto the wall of legislators in Congress. One is Moses Maimonides, and the other is, any guesses?
Moshe.
Say again?
Moshe.
Correct. Shares the name, Moshe. Moses, the lawgiver. So 2 Moseses made it on, Moses Maimonides and the Moses. Now, what's the Rambam's view? And we've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to share Rambam's view, and we'll turn to the problems it might create next week. This is Rambam. Reshut l'chol adam. Every human being has permission to now given to them. If a person wants to incline themselves toward good, and they want to be righteous, go for it. You have the power. And if you want to be wicked and evil and malevolent and vicious, you have the choice. We know this. Why? Because it's written straightforwardly in the Torah. God says, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, he says, hey, behold, ha'adam hayaka echad mimenu. Man is like us, ladat tov v'ra, to know good and bad. Klomar, what does that mean? And this is where he responds, of course, beforehand to Colin Blakemore, saying, yes, humanity is different. Yes, we believe in the scientific causal universe, but we have a principle in our creed, a central belief. Human beings are different. Hein min zeh. This species, Shel Adam, of human beings, Haya Yachid Ba'olam, is unique, is singular, is inimitable. Ve'ein min sheni dome lo b'zeh inyan. Nothing else is like it. Lions do not have free will. For all the Disney movies involving whales jumping to their freedom, only human beings have freedom in this respect. That they, in their own will, with their own mind, with their own choices, run, know good and bad, and do what they will. And this is crucial. Nobody stops them. They want to do good or evil. So contra Martin Luther King Jr., Rambam at this point seems to suggest that the moral universe doesn't bend toward justice. We have the power to bend the moral universe to or away from justice and goodness. We have the power. Now, how does Rambam prove this? Rambam proves this by saying, what's his proof? Rambam's proof is a pasuk. It says in the Torah. Now, if I were to ask you, do you have free will? What would you say to me? Put the Rambam aside. If I just met you on the street and I said, do you have free will? What would you say?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. That wasn't a guaranteed answer, but you say yes. I would say, how do you know? And what's your answer then?
Sometimes people do good, sometimes people do bad.
Okay, excellent. So Debbie's suggestion, we're now going to turn in the minute that remains. You will have to forgive me. It's the season of forgiveness. Forgive me if we go 2 minutes over. I just want to do this last screen, and then we'll do the other 15,000 another time. But so Maimonides, the main figure here, says we have the power, and his proof is biblical. He looks at a text and he says, God says we have power. So Rav Saadia Gaon, who lived a century before Maimonides, he was a 10th century Gaon living, surprisingly enough, in the Gaonic period, said the same thing. We have the power, and he says, I'll prove it to you in 4 ways, one of which is, as Debbie suggested, I think, if I understood Debbie correctly. He says, Yesh li al zeh ra'ayot, I have proofs that we have free will. Number 1, miderach hamochesh, which I think is what Debbie was hinting at, which is experience. I'm sitting here right now, and I'll ask all of you right now, do you feel like right now you have the choice to lift your hand up or not? Could you, if you really wanted, say something very loud and regrettable over Zoom in front of everybody?
Yes.
Is that a
Yeah.
dare?
Yes.
Well, with you, Michael, it might be inevitable. But I think for most of us, yeah. My experience teaches me, here he goes, Miderach HaMochesh, my experience teaches, Shematzati Adam Shoer B'nafsho, every person feels in their soul, Shiyuchal Ledaber, V'yuchal Lishtok. At any given moment, I have the sensation that I can speak or I can stay quiet. V'yuchal Litposh, V'yuchal Laniach. I can grab things, I can sit still, and I don't feel like I'm being controlled, which is what Rabbi Sachs was hinting at in his question. He says, is this all a delusion? Is this a self-flattering myth that we're in control? And he had to say, yes, but we all have that myth, at least he would have to concede. We all feel free. We all feel like we're making decisions all the time. Of course, there are things that are involuntary that we don't decide, but those are the exception that proves the rule, that we feel all the time like we're making choices. So that's his first avenue of evidence, experience. Number 2, he says, Miderach HaSeichel, he also says reason dictates. There has to be free will. And for this, we don't have to read it all inside. He says, for justice to exist in the world, there has to be free will. Otherwise, are you telling me that Hitler and Moses arrive in the afterlife and God says, welcome, you two, grab a seat next to each other? Is that what you're saying? Because both of them had no choice. Both of them just were part of the plan. Is that what you're saying? So he says, Miderach HaSeichel, just from rational reason alone, I can tell you we must have free will. Alternatively, you're going to tell me that God is unjust. And if you want to go down that route, we've got another question to address, which is theodicy, about justice in the world, which is a different series we can do another time. But on the assumption that God is just, it's impossible to imagine we don't have free will. That's his claim. Number 2. Number 3, he says, Mimasha B'Katav, I've got in scripture proofs, as we said, as Harold suggested, V'chalta b'chaim, we're told to choose life. And there are all sorts of psukim that say choose. So it seems odd for God to give those instructions if we don't have a choice. And lastly, he says, Masha Yesh B'Kabbalah, we have tradition, which means in the words of the sages, in the Talmud, in the Midrash, in the commentators. Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz, meyirat shamayim is perhaps the most famous turn of phrase that says everything is in the hands of heaven apart from fear of heaven. And we'll explore this a little further next week. And then we'll turn to why would you not say this view? Why would you not take this suggestion that of course we have free will? Why would there be another voice here to contend with suggesting that we don't have free will? And if there is such a voice, how do we gain purpose? So we went 2 minutes over. You'll have to forgive me. We are mid part 1, which I'll say was the initial plan on my part. I won't say it was the great plan or it was inevitable, but it was my hope for this evening. And next week, we'll begin with addressing the problems with taking the Maimonidean view that feels good to us, that makes me feel empowered. We'll talk about the problems with that, and then we'll shift gears to Rabbeinu Kreskes with his radical view. And Rabbeinu Kreskes will note in many ways, for a number of scholars, is actually perhaps the figure who inspired the shift towards Newtonian physics and everything that we know about the scientific universe. He, in many ways, was the progenitor of the path towards modern science, although he's not well known in that respect. We'll turn to him next week. And then in the third installment, hopefully all going to plan, as they say, we will turn to where we stand today. I'm going to stop sharing just my screen. I'll continue sharing other things. And I'm not going anywhere, so I'm happy to take questions, comments, thoughts. Nobody has